7 Strange Things That Never Made Sense About the Challenger Disaster, January 28, 1986. It was supposed to be a routine launch, a proud moment for America. A teacher in space, lessons beamed down live to children in classrooms everywhere. Instead, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger ripped itself apart across the Florida sky. Millions watched in real time. Teachers, parents, students, some cheered at first, not realizing what they were seeing. Then came the fireball, the broken plumes of smoke, and the silence. But here is the part almost no one talks about. Challenger was not just a tragedy of bad luck. It was a collision of arrogance, politics, ignored warnings, and bizarre decisions that never made sense. Why did NASA nearly put a children's television character on board? Why did engineers predict the shuttle would explode, only to be silenced? And why has so much evidence about the crew's final moments been buried for decades? This is not a tribute. This is an investigation. 7 strange things about Challenger that still haunt America. Strange thing 1. Big Bird in space. Before the Challenger ever left the ground, NASA had a problem. The shuttle program was expensive, unglamorous, and slowly losing public support. Politicians asked why taxpayers should keep funding it. The public was tuning out. NASA's answer? Turn spaceflight into entertainment. Make it something kids would beg to watch on TV. That is why the agency created the Teacher in Space program, putting Krista McAuliffe on board. But here is the twist. She was not the only idea. Behind closed doors, NASA actually reached out to Sesame Street. The pitch was outrageous. Send Big Bird, the 8-foot-tall yellow Muppet, into orbit. Carol Spinney, the puppeteer, was asked if he would be willing to fly. Imagine it. Big Bird, floating weightless, teaching children science from space. It sounds like a joke, but it was deadly serious. Only one thing stopped it. The costume was too bulky for the shuttle. So instead, NASA settled on Krista McAuliffe. The message was clear. Space was no longer about exploration, it was about publicity. Now think about that for a second. If Challenger had carried Big Bird, millions of children would have watched their beloved icon vanish in a fireball. It is almost unthinkable, but it shows how desperate NASA was for attention. And while they were chasing television moments, something far more important was being ignored. Their own engineers were screaming, "Do not launch! It will explode." Strange thing too, the engineers who knew it would explode. The night before launch, a secret meeting took place. It was not in front of cameras, not in the news, but on a late-night conference call between NASA managers and the engineers who built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Those engineers were terrified. They had studied the numbers, the weather, the history of the O-rings, and the math was simple. In freezing temperatures, the rubber seals became brittle. They would not flex. They would not seal. And tomorrow's forecast was the coldest launch day in shuttle history. Bob Ebeling, one of the senior engineers, begged NASA to wait. He laid out charts, test results, photos of previous O-ring damage. His team said it over and over, "Do not launch. It is not safe." And then came the sentence that should have stopped everything. Ebeling went home that night, looked at his wife and said, "It's going to blow up." But NASA was under pressure. The shuttle program was behind schedule, facing criticism and desperate to prove itself. A teacher in space was the perfect distraction. Postponing the launch would embarrass the agency on national television. So the executives ignored the warnings. They signed off on the flight. The engineers were silenced. The next morning, the nightmare unfolded exactly as predicted. Within seconds of ignition, fire leaked through the failed O-ring on the right booster. A tiny flame that should have never existed sliced into the fuel tank. 73 seconds later, Challenger was gone. This was not an unpredictable accident. This was a prophecy ignored. The engineers saw it coming. NASA chose not to listen. Strange thing. 3. The final words of Mike Smith. Mike Smith was the pilot of Challenger. For him, it was supposed to be the beginning, his very first mission into space. Instead, it became his last. When the shuttle ripped apart, the world saw only smoke and fire. Everyone assumed the crew was lost instantly. But the final audio recording from the cockpit tells a different, chilling story. Just seconds before the explosion, Smith's voice came through. Ooh, not a word, not a full sentence, just a gasp, a sound of realization, a human voice catching the instant something was horribly wrong. It was not the noble final message Hollywood would script. It was raw, startled, almost casual. But that tiny sound proved one thing. At least one astronaut knew disaster had struck before the shuttle disintegrated. Think about that. While the world was still cheering, while teachers were still pointing to the TV screen in classrooms, Mike Smith had already seen death coming. That fragment of audio is all that remains of his final moments. A half-finished word swallowed by flame. And the truth gets even darker. Because new evidence suggested the crew did not die instantly at all. They may have survived the explosion and faced something even more terrifying on the way down. Strange thing 4. The crew may have survived after the explosion. For years, the official story was simple. The Challenger exploded and the crew was lost instantly. It was quick. It was merciful. At least, that is what America was told. But later investigations revealed something darker. The shuttle's crew cabin did not break apart in the explosion. It held together, sealed like a capsule, as it shot upward and then began a deadly 3-mile fall back to Earth. Inside that cabin, the astronauts may still have been alive. We know this because emergency oxygen packs were found switched on. Someone, maybe more than one, had the time, the presence of mind, to reach down and flip the switch. That means they were conscious. They were fighting. Imagine that descent. 73 seconds of triumph, replaced by 2 long minutes of silence. Falling through the sky, powerless, knowing exactly what awaited below. NASA avoided this detail for years. The truth was too cruel for the public to face, that these 7 astronauts did not die in an instant, but endured the longest 2 minutes in the history of spaceflight. No cameras captured it, no microphones survived it. But the evidence is there. Challenger's crew may have lived through the explosion, only to die when the cabin slammed into the Atlantic Ocean at more than 200 miles per hour. A nation mourned the blast. Few realized the real nightmare happened after. Strange thing is the pressure from the White House and Reagan's speech. The Challenger was not just a mission, it was a television event, timed with political precision. January 28, 1986, was not chosen by accident. That evening, President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address, the most important speech of the year. Imagine the optics. Earlier that day, America sends a teacher into space. That night, the president points to her as proof of American greatness. A perfect story for the Cold War stage. NASA knew this. The White House knew this. And that is why the pressure to launch was enormous. A delay would ruin the timing. A scrubbed mission would leave Reagan standing before Congress with no historic triumph to announce. So, the schedule ruled over safety. The engineers' warnings were drowned out by politics and publicity. The shuttle had to fly. Not because it was ready, but because the cameras were waiting. And when disaster struck, Reagan himself had to rewrite history in real time. He canceled the State of the Union and instead addressed a grieving nation. His words, "They slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God," became legendary. But behind the poetry was a harsher truth. Those astronauts should never have been on that launch pad. The mission was not driven by science, but by a deadline on a political calendar. Challenger was sacrificed at the altar of image. 6. Apollo 1's ghost and the date of doom. History has a cruel way of circling back. Challenger lifted off on January 28, 1986. That date may seem ordinary until you remember what happened just one day earlier, 19 years before. January 27, 1967. Apollo 1. 3 astronauts trapped in a capsule during a ground test. A spark. A flash fire. In seconds, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were gone, burned alive on the launch pad. And now, almost 2 decades later, NASA rolled out another spacecraft on nearly the same anniversary. Engineers were warning of danger. The weather was hostile. The omen could not have been clearer. Yet Challenger was launched anyway. To many, it felt like history was whispering or screaming that the space program had not learned its lesson. Apollo 1 had exposed flaws in design and culture. Challenger revealed that those flaws were not just technical, but cultural, embedded in the system. Deadlines over safety, image over truth. The coincidence of dates was never officially acknowledged by NASA. But to the families, to the engineers who fought to stop the launch, it felt like fate repeating itself. A grim anniversary, sealed by fire and smoke. Some say Challenger was doomed long before the countdown began, not by physics, but by a culture that could not stop repeating its own mistakes. Strange Thing 7, the soccer ball that refused to die. Among the twisted wreckage of Challenger, one object stood out. Not a piece of metal, not a fragment of technology, but a simple soccer ball. It belonged to astronaut Ellison Onizuka. He had brought it aboard as a keepsake, a small token from his daughter's high school team. The ball was supposed to float in space, a symbol of dreams carried beyond Earth. Instead, it fell back in flames. And yet, somehow, it survived. Charred wreckage filled the ocean, but that soccer ball was recovered intact. No tears, no burn marks, just a silent reminder of what had been lost. For years, it sat quietly at Clear Lake High School in Texas, a memorial in a glass case. Students passed by without always knowing the story, but the story was not over. 3 decades later, another astronaut, Shane Kimbrough, carried the same ball into orbit aboard the International Space Station. He photographed it floating in zero gravity, finally completing the journey it was meant to take. Think about that. Challenger was destroyed, 7 lives cut short, yet a child's soccer ball endured. It traveled through fire, waited for 30 years, and finally touched the stars. It is haunting. It is beautiful. And it reminds us that space exploration is not just about rockets and politics. It is about fragile human dreams, sometimes destroyed in an instant, sometimes surviving against all odds. A soccer ball outlived the shuttle. A toy accomplished the mission that 7 heroes could not. The long-term consequences. Did NASA fix the culture or just the hardware? In the days after Challenger, the nation demanded answers. Wreckage was pulled from the ocean, hearings were broadcast live, and NASA officials were grilled on television. The Rogers Commission, packed with legends like Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, delivered its verdict. NASA had ignored its own rules. Managers had gambled with human lives. The shuttle program went dark for nearly 3 years. Engineers redesigned the O-rings. Safety checklists were rewritten. New procedures promised this would never happen again. On the surface, NASA looked humbled, even reborn. But the deeper question was never truly answered. Had the culture changed, or just the hardware? Because 17 years later, in 2003, the nightmare returned. The shuttle Columbia broke apart on re-entry. And once again, the investigation revealed the same poison at work. Warnings ignored, concerns silenced, deadlines prioritized. The technology was different, but the mindset was the same. That is why Challenger still matters. It is not just history. It is a warning about what happens when organizations put image over honesty, when managers bury engineers under bureaucracy, when political calendars outweigh safety checklists. Debris from Challenger kept washing ashore for years, ghostly reminders that the story was not over. And in a sense, it never will be, because the true lesson of Challenger was not about seals or rockets. It was about people. And whether they had the courage to listen when someone said, "It's going to blow up." The Challenger is not just history. It is a warning written in fire across the sky. So I will leave you with this. Which of these truths shocked you the most? And if progress demands sacrifice, what should never be sacrificed? Because in the end, the Challenger did not just explode in front of us. It left a question hanging in the air, a question we still have not answered.